The unmistakable opening bars of Rachmaninoff's second piano concerto. The pianist was Kirill Gerstein, our guest this week, with the Berliner Philharmoniker, directed by Kirill Petrenko. I'm James Jolly and welcome to this Gramophone podcast. The Rachmaninoff Concerto is one half of a twinned digital release, Rachmaninoff 150, from Platoon, that also includes a selection of Rachmaninoff's solo works. I caught up with Kirill Gerstein in London recently on an auspicious day for the composer. So it seems highly appropriate. Here we are 2 days after Rachmaninoff's 150th anniversary to be talking about Rachmaninoff. Now, I think we'll be focusing on two works here, the second piano concerto and the Corelli Variations. Second piano concerto is interesting because as a composer and interpreter, we have two recordings from him, 1924, 1929, both with the Philadelphia and Stokowski, which is a sort of an interesting modern example of a composer's work being archived, as it were, for sound purposes as well as, actually in the written score. I mean, for an interpreter like you, how important are the recordings?
Oh, I think they're of seminal importance. And I think the recordings, particularly of Rachmaninoff, are invaluable resources to learn from. And I would say not only about his music, obviously so, but also generally about musical performance. And it's, of course, not a given with a great composer that it should also be a great performer. And in case of Rachmaninoff, it is resoundingly so. We can say, I think, that he's clearly a great conductor. We only have, unfortunately, just a couple recordings of him conducting for the orchestra, but it's clear that he's a great conductor, and it's abundantly clear that he's one of the greatest pianists to have ever touched the keyboard. In the case of the concerto recordings, and particularly the second, we have the luxury of these two recordings, so there's the further comparison one can make. But there are really a number of things that are answered or supplement what is notated. Even such things as, accelerandi that he does in transitions that are not marked in the score, or the way he shapes the second theme of the first movement, which is very particular, very convincing, and also not exactly what is notated, or it's not notated as fully as it becomes clear in his interpretations. So I think it's absolutely impossible to ignore this as part of the study and preparation to interpret his music.
And how do the two recordings compare, the 24 and the 29?
Interesting. There are times that I prefer one or the other. I would say what is interesting, that though there are naturally details and certain moments that are different, there is a certain consistency of interpretation while he's able to maintain the seeming spontaneity of his playing. I think looking at these two recordings confirms what is anyway in the air elsewhere, that these are very constructed interpretations. And I mean that not at all in a negative sense, but that there is a great level of refinement and precision to the emotional impact and to the rubato that he wants to deliver and to the flow of the piece, and that the architecture essentially stays what it is. There's in fact a story I can add. I once played this with a very well-known and respected Russian conductor who said to me, the recordings of Rachmaninoff, also it was particularly about the second piano concerto because that was what we were playing. He said, don't listen to the tempi of Rachmaninoff's performance, because this is, when he went to America and he was no longer so in touch with the Russian tradition. This is a narrative that you and I can anyway discuss, sort of the troubles that Rachmaninoff experienced not being accepted in the West in some way and not being accepted in another way simultaneously in the Soviet Union. But interestingly, recently I've come across research. It's an article that can be found on the internet into Mengelberg's scores. And Mengelberg at Concertgebouw had done the piece very early on with Rachmaninoff. I might be mistaken, but maybe circa 1908. So the piece is 6-7 years old. And as we know, Mengelberg was very meticulous about marking his scores, including putting down the metronome markings of the pieces that he was doing. And in the case of the second piano concerto for Rachmaninoff, we have the surviving score. And Mengelberg took care to notate in different sections, not only just movements, but within the movements in different sections, the metronome markings of the speeds that Rachmaninoff took. And interestingly enough, even through this longer period from 1908 or so to the late 20s when he records, the tempi that Rachmaninoff takes also stay rather consistent and certainly dispel the theory of this conductor that, when he left Russia after the revolution, his tempi became westernized and quicker. So that's interesting. So I think there is an interpretive consistency, though the fluidity of details is noticeable between the two recordings.
Listening to him as a player, particularly in this work, and there are loads of things that sort of strike one. One is the incredible lightness of touch he had as a pianist, the way his fingers just kind of fly over the keys. You can almost, barely, I don't know, it's an extraordinary sensation.
Absolutely. And there's several aspects to marvel at additionally. First of all, we're listening to a pianist in his late 50s, and then eventually, with the third concerto in his mid 60s. And to this day, these pieces remain also athletically challenging, and it's not self-evident to be in that level of pianistic fitness. So just that alone is something to marvel at. The sense of rubato, I think, is breathtaking and absolutely unique in Rachmaninoff, where you feel that it's both inevitable and unpredictable. And in retrospect, you understand, yes, of course, but as you listen, it just takes you along and attempts to trick the ear, even with repeated listening and analytical listening. And so this is something very particular to him. And I would say that indeed his playing is very classicist, in the sense that he plays with aristocratic discipline, restraint, structural oversight. And so indeed many of these torrents of notes are played very lightly as ornamentation. And in that sense, he's not doing something that different from Haydn or Beethoven, that there are main notes and structural pillars, and there's a lot of ornamentation that lightly feathers in the air. So I agree with your observation, and I think it's a great lesson that often one hears these pieces played with a sort of degree of earnesty that then overloads the listening experience. And then one could say, well, is it too many notes in Rachmaninoff? But in fact, no. And he shows that a lot of them are meant to be very precise but small.
So with the second concerto, you have these two recordings. First recordings, the composer playing his own music. You have the score, and then somewhere in the background there's a tradition. How do you decide, am I going to go completely with the score, or am I going to try and not imitate, but think himself into certain rubato and kind of come to a conclusion that isn't a sort of, because you clearly don't want to do a sort of imitation of Rachmaninoff.
And it's rather impossible to.
And it's impossible anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. This is very much on my mind. I think to sort of cleanse oneself of the tradition, I think the score is absolutely the salvation. It remains a very fresh and a very detailed score with a lot of fortunate ambiguity, in the sense that one could see it going various ways, and therein lays the interpretive possibility, and the score helps to approach that and somehow abstract oneself from even, this sort of cinematic feeling when you start playing those opening chords. It's like, oh my God, I'm playing this Rachmaninoff's Second Concerto, which is a thing larger than life and larger than the score. And simultaneously, the recordings, as I just said, are a great source of information. They do suggest some things that I like more than how he notates them in the score. So things that are structural and structural rubato and structural change of time between sections, I think is very telling from the recordings, and I do take into account a lot of them, maybe not all of them.
I mean, quite often when you get, and I mean, it's not that common a thing, but when you get a composer who's a great performer, and I'm thinking of someone like Mahler, who, was self-evidently, a really great conductor. When you look at his scores, you can tell the guy not is only writing the music, but he knows the pitfalls of what an orchestra may do and what it may not do, and he puts in details to kind of help the conductor. Do you get the sense, looking at a Rachmaninoff, particularly a concerto score, that he's writing it not as just as the composer, but potentially also as the performer, to say, well, that might be a problem, so I'm going to help you out by suggesting here, or I'm putting this in which will get you over this pitfall?
Yes, absolutely. I think in terms of piano writing, you could say throughout, I think he too becomes more experienced, and it's very much so in the third piano concerto. He becomes more and more aware of the pitfalls. In that sense, the second concerto is more prone to interpretation, you could say, because I feel with the third concerto, if the pianist, and that's not a given, but if the pianist can do what the piano part demands in the orchestra puts in their part, and the conductor, then the third concerto sort of comes out. Some better, some worse, but more or less. The second concerto is, you could say, almost Schumannesque, Tchaikovsky-like, comparing now the Schumann Piano Concerto and Tchaikovsky first, where so much depends on a conductor and soloist and orchestra finding the same wavelength and staying within that spectrum, because these transitions and these balances in the second piano concerto are not a given and need to be actively produced. And even sometimes you have the best intentions and maybe a feeling of a common understanding, and still on a given night it's somehow not as much in the air as you would wish. So it's a much more youthful and fragile and romantic kind of creature.
And listening to your performance of the second concerto, this is with the Berlin Philharmoniker and Kirill Petrenko, I get the sense that there was a lot of preparation. I mean, it's one of those performances you think, actually, this is one of those occasions where the pianist and the conductor are really in sync. They really kind of know what the other is going to do. I just sort of sense it. And even though unusually, it was recorded outdoors. This was at a Waldbühne concert, but I have to say, you would never know it from the recording. I mean, did you rehearse sort of longer than you would normally get?
Yes, and I think much of it is thanks to Kirill Petrenko and the Berlin Philharmonic, but the seriousness and let's say passion of involvement that we were able to approach this piece with for this performance that ended up being part of this new release is unusual. And we've played this concerto many times, and it started with Kirill Petrenko saying he would like to have a long meeting with me, sort of conductor pianist. And some of my meetings for this concerto have been literally 60 seconds, where the conductor asks you, how do you play this one scale in the second movement? It's okay, you know how it goes, I know how it goes, we'll see you in the rehearsal. But I arrived at the Philharmonie, and first of all, Kirill immediately said, well, I've already rehearsed some of the concerto today without you. And, again, Berlin Philharmonic, one of the greatest orchestras. Of course, they have heard the tunes. They know how it goes. So the fact that he would rehearse the concerto without the solo part is already remarkable. And then we had a meeting that was about 2.5 hours where very lovingly we went over, I would say literally every relevant detail of how does the piece flow from the pianist to the conductor to the different threads of orchestra, and over and over, and trying it like this and trying it like that. Oh, could we try another time? Said Kirill, maybe I give the upbeat on 3. No, let's try on 4. And so we really went through it. And afterwards, Kirill, and throughout, he also said, as I have been relearning this piece in preparation for this concert, this is so, he's really a special unicorn in our world of this degree of care and love in preparation. And then we had a full good rehearsal, an hour and a half, with the orchestra in the Philharmonie, and also with many, many places that sounded good in the first time, but Kirill searching for particular turn of phrase or expression. There's some things that were repeated 7, 8 times, iconic places. And you know what? It gets even better if the right person is searching with the right skill set and inspires the musicians to deliver. And then we had the rehearsal at Waldbühne, so the general run through, because this concert was also filmed. So we played it through, which so often, or pretty much nearly always in today's music business conditions, that would be, thank you very much, and we'll see you tomorrow at the concert. But then he still kept the orchestra for another 20, 30 minutes and rehearsed the certain bits of the concerto more. So yes, there was a lot of preparation. I think we managed to avoid the feeling of overtension for, we have set out certain markers and no matter what, we have to treat them. But there was just plenty of time to communicate with the musical material and with each other. And then in the concert, there's the adrenaline, other things, anyway, change the moment. And yet I felt a strong sense of alignment with the musicians in the orchestra and Kirill. And of course, it's very much due to his ability not only to rehearse and to show, but actual conducting control in the moment and getting that response from the orchestra, because indeed there is not much of an acoustic at Waldbühne on the stage, and some of it really very much, and more so than usual, relies on the communication and visual signals from the conductor, because not everybody can hear each other in a way that maybe one hears more so at the Philharmonie in Berlin. And amazing job by the recording team, because as you said, you wouldn't, there's sometimes noise from the live ambience, but essentially it sounds better than many studio recordings, and this is recording technique also.
Well, I hope it hasn't ruined you for concerto performances in future, when you're told, oh yeah, we're doing Beethoven Third Concerto. We got 3 hours of rehearsal and that's it.
Yeah, well, yes and no. It's a tremendous luxury that, on the other hand, one could say shouldn't be a luxury at all, because music, even well-known pieces, or perhaps particularly well-known pieces, need a lot of rehearsal time and contemplation and refreshment, so they are able to stay fresh. On the other hand, I think one can abstract oneself that, especially as a soloist, one has to be somehow adjusting to the situation, and there are those situations where it's that kind of preparation and penetration into the material, and there are others where, let's politely call it's going to be a more spontaneous situation. But yes, it's true, it sometimes can feel too anonymous. incredible professionalism of everybody involved, and they could say, well, somehow we'll be able to get through the Paganini Rhapsody even if we don't rehearse. But finally, that isn't.
It's a different sort of music making, then, isn't it?
Yeah,
or you could even argue it's not really. Well, yeah, it is music making, but it's not. It's not a coming together. It is a coming together, but it's not a discussed or a rehearsed.
It's not a joint music making. It's sort of doing it at the same time rather than doing it together, and sometimes that brings nice results. But I think it is truly more interesting to delve into these things,
and particularly sort of well-known works, because I think it's important. Every so often they are, as it were, reset, and you're saying let's sweep everything out in the way. Let's go back to the score and do it as we think it should be done.
Yeah, well, it sort of becomes the well-known works should be rehearsed for that reason, and the unknown works have to be rehearsed to get to know them. So basically,
need to rehearse everything.
I think it's Yo-Yo Ma that somewhere said, that, and I think not only, but that the majority of any even very actively concertizing musician is spent practicing and rehearsing. The performance, I think Christian Zimmerman said it as well, the performances are really a tip of the iceberg. And as Glenn Gould wonderfully said, that that music making is for him was not goal oriented towards these momentary ejaculations of adrenaline, but this is a lifelong contemplation of the musical art. And I think that's true for performances, and it's true for a listening experience.
So for the solo sort of side of this album, you actually did go back into the Philharmonie. So this is, in the acoustic that you missed maybe for the concerto, not that it really mattered. And the main work here is the Corelli Variations, which of course Rachmaninoff never recorded. So you don't have that luxury or whatever you might call it.
Very sadly.
And this is later. This is Rachmaninoff in 1931. At his holiday home in Switzerland, writing these work, and I find it a fascinating work. It's got a colour that's very unusual, and there's a sort of mood about it. For a sort of theme and variation, there's a certain kind of expectation, which he delivers in a completely unusual way.
Yes, and the album is a bit designed to give a small glimpse, because we are within the scope of an album, to give a glimpse of Rachmaninoff at different stages of his writing output. So the smaller pieces, some are coming even from before the concerto. And of course, the concerto is sort of the early ripe style, and the Corelli Variations, indeed, a very late work. I think possibly we were influenced by knowing the biographical facts, but I think it does sound like a work by an experienced composer, a work in late style. I think the way the coda of the Corelli Variations dissipates, where sort of music just disintegrates and there's no more piece. It's just sort of these phrases float apart from each other as in space and weightlessness. And I think that's something that is hard to imagine, that one writes that kind of devastated music as a younger person. I mean, one can write very tragic music, and Rachmaninoff did that wonderfully. But this feels like a late work in many ways. Of course, we know this is like a at-home version of the Paganini Rhapsody, which is the next opus and a much more public kind of piece. And I think Rachmaninoff's style, like often in later years, you see that it condenses. It becomes more of its own essence. It's less opulent than earlier. It's more acerbic. And, he's often blamed as a sort of anachronism. And I think it's not entirely fair, though one of the replies is, I think it's Franz Werfel that said that to outlive an era, you need to be an anachronism. And so in that sense, so here we are talking about Rachmaninoff, who certainly outlived his era and outlived the modernists that were criticizing him. But in another way, in any case, he's a modern man who responds to whatever is happening. He responded throughout his life to whatever was happening socially, historically, politically, and musically, and the ground is really shifting under him violently, as 20th century did. And he reacts to I think, to what he hears. I think it's true that you can hear traces of American music in his later works, including some hints of jazz, without recoursing to saying, Rachmaninoff lived in America, so it sounds jazzy. But you hear traces of that. You hear certain...
It's more colour.
Yeah, and a certain musical cubism, certain almost kind of geometrical playing with patterns. Now still covered in his romanticism and in this luscious piano writing. Even as it pares down, it's still, luscious. So he reacts, and there is the nostalgia, of course, that was part of him, but also was very much ready to be consumed by post-First World War society. There is, I think, a craving for nostalgia, and he fit into that perfectly. And so I think all those things are audible, but also it's a very virile work, the Corelli Variations. I think there's a lot of strength and even certain kind of athleticism in it, which is also, again, remarkable for a composer in his and pianist in his 60s as he writes it. It's, I think, a very important work of his. And though everything by Rachmaninoff has been well represented in the recorded catalog, but in fact, even if one looks at the number of recordings, Corelli Variations are less represented in his output than, say, the Second Piano Sonata or the Preludes or the Etude Tableaus.
Part of Variation 14 from the middle of Rachmaninoff's Corelli Variations. It was played by my guest Kirill Gerstein. Currently available as a twinned digital release, Rachmaninoff 150 from Platoon, the two halves will be united on a single CD in the summer from the Berliner Philharmoniker. Gramophone podcasts are free, so if you enjoy them, then a really great way to support our work is to take out a subscription to Gramophone magazine. Over 13 issues a year, we bring you hundreds of reviews by our expert critics, as well as in-depth articles about the latest classical music releases and the most exciting musicians of the day. And if you head over to gramophone.co.uk/subscribe and enter the code podcast20 in the checkout, you can even get a 20% discount off any subscription package. We really value your support. And consider leaving a review or rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. And do look out for another Gramophone podcast very soon.